Brazil, Tuesday, February 13th, 1996. 5 days before the start of Carnival. The laughter and gaiety that is part of the people of Rio de Janeiro was drowned out in a flood of tears. The rain started sometime in the early hours of the morning. By 9 o'clock, the roads were becoming impassable. Houses near the many rivers and tributaries were filling with water. Many left their homes to find shelter on higher ground, taking little or nothing with them. By noon, the rain had stopped and the water began to recede. But the reprieve was short-lived. Late in the afternoon, the rains began falling in great torrents, thick, heavy, overwhelming. It fell hardest in Jacarepaguá, west of the center of the city. Lowland surrounded on 3 sides by mountains and on one side by a vast stretch of sparkling white sand which opens to the Atlantic Ocean. Surrounded by mountains, Jacarepaguá is riddled with waterways that channel the rains from the mountains to the sea. 2 major rivers, Rio Grande and Rio do Anil, pass through some of Jacarepaguá's largest favelas, including New Aurora, the City of God, and River of Rocks. They merge on their way to Barra da Tijuca. Before dark, those along the rivers had once again piled their few belongings on tables and shelves as they watched their homes fill again with the muddy water. The rain came down in torrents, and residents feared for the worst. Many left their homes while others stayed to protect what little they had. At 9 p.m., those living near the foot of the mountains heard what sounded like an explosion. The water began to rise so rapidly that those who had stayed behind became trapped in their homes by the force of the water against their doors and their fear that the current would carry away their belongings like a giant vacuum. Within 10 minutes, the water rose another meter. There are many stories to be told. Dalva had lived in Anil along a major canal since she was a child. She had frequently seen water swirling inside her home as the result of Rio's summer rains. Her home was made of concrete and therefore survived this constant abuse. She was dismayed to see water enter her home for the second time that day. As her husband was putting the family dog into the crawl space between the ceiling and the roof, the water rose rapidly. Her husband, swimming through their home, was able to reach Dalva and bring her too into the crawl space. Across the canal was worse. There, the people's homes were made of tin, plywood, scrap metal, or even heavy cardboard. Dalva heard their screams and watched helplessly as their homes were consumed by the river. She saw trees and televisions, refrigerators and cars swept along in the rushing waters. In despair, she saw a family of 4 inside their car, being swept along in the current, powerless to do more than scream for help and pray for God's mercy. Jussara and her husband lived in the River of Rocks, also along the Rio Grande, closer to the sea. Their home was made of concrete, and she, like Dalva, was used to the floods of summer. As the house filled up, they sought shelter on the roof, fighting for space with the rats, snakes, giant centipedes, and other creatures fleeing the water. They looked on mutely as all that they owned was swept away. That night, Jussara's neighbor became a victim of the flood. Another neighbor lost 3 children to the waters because her house, made of wood, did not withstand the onslaught. Raquel lived in New Horizons, the poorest part of the favela City of God. All of the homes of New Horizons were precariously built shacks without running water or sanitation. It was located on the far side of the river on swampy land shunned by anyone who could find something better. Only one bridge connected New Horizons to the rest of the favela. That night, Raquel was home with her husband and 4 young children. With the rapid rise of the water, they realized that their home wouldn't survive the impact. Each with a child on their shoulders and a child in their arms, they started for the bridge. It was gone, washed away seconds earlier in a huge crush of rushing water. Screaming for help, they were sighted by firemen, who miraculously brought all of them to safety. As they crossed, they saw another fireman rescuing a woman and her baby, when all 3 were swept away. The next morning, there was nothing but ruins left of New Horizons. That night, there were many unsung heroes. While a small group of firemen and other residents concentrated their efforts on New Horizons, most of Jacarepaguá was left without professional help. Stories abound of brave men and women like Marcelo, who courageously put himself in danger to rescue children, relatives, and neighbors. Even the drug traffickers put themselves at personal risk as they saved the people in the city of God. What made the water rise so rapidly? The rain, which had been coming down in torrents throughout the night and morning, had completely saturated the soil. Because of so much deforestation in the mountains, there were few trees and plants to help with the absorption and to hold the soil in place with their web of roots. When the rain started falling later that afternoon, the water-soaked soil could hold no more. Like a balloon that pops when too much air is let in, the ground burst forth, spewing out boulders, soil, vegetation, and water. On February 13th, 74 mudslides occurred in the mountains surrounding Jacarepaguá. The largest, which occurred at 9 p.m., came to be known as Mudslide of Quichich. With an extension of 1.5 kilometers, it was fed by dozens of smaller slides. Rocks, soil, and plant matter converged in the waterways of Mounts Quichich and Papagayo, which joined to form the Rio do Anil. The origin of the slide was at an altitude of 600 meters above sea level, and the volume of material in the slide was estimated at 150,000 meters cubed, or 16,000 tons, when it reached the lowlands of Jacarepaguá. 2 other giant mudslides left deep crevices in the surface of the mountains. As the rain continued on into the 14th, 44 more mudslides occurred. The monthly average rainfall in the mountains is measured at 239.5 millimeters. On the 13th, the rainfall there reached 201.2 millimeters. Over 48 hours, the rainfall in Jacarepaguá totaled 304.1 millimeters. Thousands of tons of earth and plant matter mixed with the trash already clogging Rio's water system combined to completely fill all the waterways. With no place to go, the water and mud spread out beyond the banks to create a flood of sweeping proportions. Estimates vary on the number of people left homeless, from several thousand to more than 10,000. The official number of homeless in Jacarepaguá was finally set at 5,590. The number of those who died in the flood is also contested. Witnesses report that hundreds died, especially in the City of God. However, the official count is closer to 60. Many of those who lived in New Horizons in other parts of the City of God or River of Rocks had no official identity. They left the world as they had come, quietly, anonymously. The next day, with the water receding, came the gruesome task of looking for bodies. Some in Itanyangá, which is in the mountains south of Jacarepaguá, had been buried in earth. In the City of God, residents and firemen searched through the shallows. As with most natural disasters, the greatest toll was taken on the children. At the foot of Quichich are several upper-middle-class communities filled with luxurious and beautiful mansions. Quichich showed no favoritism when it showered boulders into the lowlands below. The massive force of the slide was awesome. About 100 homes were destroyed. Boulders larger than cars hurled themselves through living rooms. Mud and rocks filled first floors and entombed swimming pools. Mountain streams changed course, some finding new pathways through and between these homes. The mud, too, was a thing of horror and wonder. When Dalva was able to descend from her crawl space in the roof, she was confronted with nearly a meter of thick, sticky, clay-like mud inside her house. Her car was elevated over 1/2 meter, resting inside the garage on a bed of earth. For those in the City of God and the River of Rocks whose homes were left intact, the story was the same. Mud inside, mud outside, mud on clothes, on dishes, on photos, on sofas and beds, on sheets and towels and baby carriages. There was no place that the mud was not. The part of one's life that had not been carried away by the flood lay in ruins. The task of cleaning up was overwhelming. At that time, Rio's civil defense was not prepared for large-scale disaster. Previously, they had pinpointed 12 major areas in the city at risk for mudslides. None had included any of the hard-hit communities in Jacarepaguá. When residents called for help, they were told that the priority lay in Rio's rich communities to the south, who were already receiving an influx of tourists for Carnival. Jacarepaguá was also isolated. Having little access over or through the mountains, residents were cut off from the rest of the city by mud, boulders, and other debris strewn across the roads. In the City of God and River of Rocks, the fire department had worked continuously since the beginning of the rains to help flood victims. Residents of these communities found shelter in local schools. Within 2 days, city officials and NGOs had begun the task of organizing people and providing for their needs. Looting was also a problem. In the City of God, hungry victims began taking what they needed from grocery stores and trucks carrying food and medicines. The luxury homes torn open by hurling rocks and rushing earth were left vacant and vulnerable. As the vultures came to pick on the remains, even the rich were forced to stand guard over what was left of their lives. Thousands of people in Jacarepaguá were left homeless. Many, like Jussara and her husband, sought shelter with relatives, where they remained for 2 years. Others were housed in schools and churches. Without a plan for organizing such a multitude, the schools soon became places of mass chaos. Maria José left the schools after only a few days. Unable to tolerate the noise, the stench, and the fear that lingered, she returned to her space by the fallen wall at Marquechicente and built a simple lean-to. For 3 weeks, she slept curled on the ground with nothing over her head but a large plank of wood. As her neighbors returned, together they rebuilt their flimsy wooden homes. Even as the flood destroyed, so it gave reason to create. With little help from authorities, neighbors joined together to provide for those in need. Shacks went up, mud was dug out of homes, and belongings washed and restored in a spirit of true caring and solidarity. By the 15th of February, the NGO Viva Rio had initiated a nationwide campaign for collecting donations. All over Brazil, people sent food, water, blankets, mattresses, medicines, and clothing to aid the victims of Jacarepaguá. Resident associations and other groups received the much-needed items, which were then distributed by local volunteers. Supermarkets, department stores, the Rotary and the Lions Clubs, pharmaceuticals, and labor unions all sent greatly needed supplies. The army joined in, sending in 20 soldiers and 2 trucks. Even a notorious drug trafficker donated $3,000 to buy food for hungry children. However, in many places, the traffickers also oversaw the distribution of donations, seeing first to their own needs and the needs of their closest friends. In the City of God alone, 1,238 people were sheltered in schools, entirely dependent on official help and neighborly aid. Most remember that experience as humiliating and degrading. 20 to 30 men, women, and children were housed in a single room. Reports of fights, bad food, not enough food, stolen belongings, soap opera sex scandals, the proliferation of illnesses such as meningitis and tuberculosis, and no place to flee from contamination. Raquel recalled the worst part of staying in the schools was watching people die of leptospirosis. For many, the nightmare seemed endless. Some were placed in temporary housing after 3 months. For others, their sojourn through the schools lasted nearly 2 years. As word of the flood spread throughout Brazil, many tourists canceled their reservations for Carnival. However, little news of the flood reached the international community. During Carnival, schools of samba, like Mocidade in the City of God, compete as they dance and sing through the center of Rio. This year, Mocidade's glittering, flamboyant costumes and mesmerizing floats were washed away in a river of tears. With courage and resilience, learned from the constant defeats faced daily in the favela, they paraded through Rio, dressed in borrowed clothing, marching silently, but for the single beat of a drum, reverberating to the world the slow, loud pulse of their life. The day after the flood, with much of the city submerged in mud, both the governor and the mayor flew to the United States for business as usual. On his return, the mayor, Cesar Maya, reported that he had tried removing the people living in risk areas in 1993. At that time, Governor Leonel Brizola decreed that the migrants could stay on the land that they had invaded. Furthermore, Cesar Maya had warned the residents time and time again of the risks. Even if they had no place else to go, no, it wasn't his fault. Although the municipal agencies had failed to respond to the initial crisis, they did organize for cleanup. They promptly removed the vast amounts of water-ruined furniture, cars, appliances large and small, which collected in the streets as residents emptied their flood-stained homes. Eventually, the city began its long-term work on the many mud-packed rivers and canals. Progress has been made, but the going is slow. Enormous reforms are needed before the waterways of Jacarepaguá will be sufficiently wide, free of trash, and safe during the summer storms. Rio recognized its need to organize a plan for civil defense. In September 1996, a warning system was instituted that alerted residents of the possibility of mudslides. It went into operation in February of 1999, providing a short-term warning of 3 hours or less of intense rainfall before it starts to rain. Gruji, an NGO, is also teaching the people of Jacarepaguá how to prepare for and react to floods. The city provided food and water for those living in the schools as they awaited government-built housing. 616 families from New Horizons in the City of God were moved to temporary housing at Vargem Pequena after 3 months. About a year later, these families were able to move into permanent housing on the same site. Vargem Pequena lies 40 minutes from any schools, shopping centers, or medical facilities. Public transportation is inadequate, and there are no school buses. Because she cannot afford bus fare, Raquel cannot send her children to school. Vargem Pequena is built on top of a toxic waste dump, once the home of byproducts from the hospitals and many pharmaceutical companies that pepper Jacarepaguá. Tall tubes shoot up through the concrete, releasing poisonous gases. Before they had electricity, the city would come by and throw a match into the tubes, illuminating the sky with the fumes. This went on for more than a year. As a reaction to the fumes, Raquel's son went into a coma, and for 3 days she didn't know if he would live or die. He recovered from that episode, but lives, like all those in Vargem Pequena, in the shadow of death. Most of the victims of the flood blamed the municipal government. To them, it appeared that the waterways were incapable of controlling such vast amounts of water, especially when clogged with trash. Few seemed aware of the extraordinary mudslides that occurred which no one could have prevented. Because many saw others die, they believed that God had favored them like Noah from the force of the flood. Their faith and resiliency, their hold on life and love for their children give them a nobility and dignity that no person or disaster can touch. As Anna observed, when the waters covered the ground and we didn't know where to walk, God showed us where the holes were.
Eu vi pai chorar, eu vi mãe sofrer, porque tanta tristeza eu não consigo entender. Eu vi mãe sofrer, eu vi pai chorar, chorar. A chuva caiu, a água não para de rolar. Começou a chuviscar, o povo não sabia que era o começo do que aconteceria. Em todo o estado houve uma grande enchente. Foi pai salvando o filho e mãe ficando carente. Não sei como pode tudo desabar assim. É cena dos meus olhos, parecia um mundo sem fim. A água foi subindo e o povo começou a suspender-lhe as suas coisas que com sufoco comprou. Um amor tão lindo se tornou cruel. Hoje ele está na terra e ela foi morar no céu. Eu vi pai chorar, eu vi mãe sofrer. Porque tanta tristeza eu não consigo entender. Mas eu vi mãe sofrer, e eu vi pai chorar, chorar. A chuva caiu, a água não para de rolar. As águas rolavam como o choro das crianças, de pais aflitos que não tinha esperança de achar um amigo, pai ou filho ou irmão. Descendo pela enchente, amigo, não é mole não. Casas e barracos, soterrado pela enchente. Na cidade de Deus ainda o povo tem em mente.
A água que vem da terra, a água que vem do céu, é a mesma que mata a sede, que molha a terra seca e a aba do chapéu. A água que vem da serra, que desce pro ribeirão e faz figa pro cerrado, que corre solto e farto pra outra direção. Água da vida que molha o coração, luz no caminho, clareia a escuridão. Água da vida que molha o coração, luz no caminho, clareia a escuridão da vida toda. Água que vem do poço, que o tempo desativou. Outrora foi água viva e hoje sofre o silêncio que alguém sentenciou. A água que vem dos olhos, do poço da solidão, é um fio do rio de dentro que espera o seu momento de arrebentar então. Água da vida que molha o coração, luz no caminho, clareia a escuridão. Água da vida que molha o coração, luz no caminho, clareia a escuridão. Água da vida que molha o coração, clareia a escuridão. Água da vida que molha o coração, luz no caminho, clareia a escuridão.